welcome to the West Asia Post. I am Ghadi Francis and this is our weekly show where we bring you all the latest updates, stories and news from a region that I call my home, West Asia. Today, our top story is from Palestine. There has been deadly exchange for the past few weeks, but in the latest, scores of Israeli settlers carried on a violent rampage in the town of Hawara, southern Nablus in the West Bank. They set homes, cattle, trees and cars on fire in the middle of the night. Here's the report.
Raids, attacks, violence, rising death toll, unending misery. And the circle continues. This is how it's been for months since fresh incidents of raids and attacks started spiking in Israel and Palestine. Violence has been on the rise in Israel and Palestine since Benjamin Netanyahu took over at the helm of the coalition government with the far-right parties in Israel. On Sunday, a Palestinian killed 2 Israeli men in Hawara. This came in retaliation against an Israeli raid in the northern city of Nablus last week, in which 11 Palestinians were killed. On Sunday night, Jewish settlers rampaged through a Palestinian village in Hawara in the West Bank. The settlers set fire to houses and cars. 1 Palestinian was also killed during the attacks. More than 350 Palestinians were injured. 1 Palestinian was also killed during the attacks. More than 350 Palestinians were injured. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society said most of them were stricken by tear gas inhalation. The town's council said 30 houses were burned and damaged. More than 100 cars were torched by the settlers. Israeli rights groups called the Hawara attack a pogrom. It was the worst such violence in decades. About 300 to 400 people went to the area for revenge. Reports said 8 Israelis were detained, but most of them have been released now. Palestinian officials said there were attacks on other neighboring Palestinian villages also. The rampage took place shortly after the Jordanian government hosted talks between Israel and Palestine on Sunday. Jordan said the two sides had agreed to take steps to de-escalate tensions and freeze settlements for a few months. However, just after the summit, Israel said there was no such agreement. Just after the Israelis attacked Hawara town, the United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting. The meeting was held at the request of the United Arab Emirates. Palestine's envoy to the UN, Riyad Mansour, said the Security Council has an obligation to find ways to provide protection for Palestinian civilians. Last week, for the first time in 6 years, the Security Council denounced the building of Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories. The statement was also approved by the United States. Though violence is not new to the region, the fresh bout started with the visit of Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound within days of taking office. Ben-Gvir's visit was condemned by Palestinians and the Muslim world, with the UN calling for maintaining status quo at the site. Tensions have risen further since Netanyahu returned to power in December. His government includes religious ultra-nationalists in key cabinet posts, promising a tougher stance and enraging Palestinians. The far-right government has sparked fears of a military escalation in the West Bank, occupied by Israel since the 1967 war. However, within his country, Netanyahu seems to be struggling to keep the ruling coalition together. While protests in Israel continue over the government's judicial reforms, Netanyahu has faced high-profile resignations and protests within his own government in recent days. Concerns continue to mount, particularly among partners farthest on the right, over broken promises. On Monday, lawmakers from the far-right Otzma Yehudit party boycotted a Knesset session. The boycott was over the government's lenient policy of containment after violence in the West Bank. Earlier, Ben Gvir warned he would resign in 3 months if the government did not implement some of his policies, even if it meant bringing down the coalition. Thus, compounded with internal politics and pressure on responding to recent incidents of attacks on Israelis, Netanyahu seems to be under pressure from all sides. The West Bank is home to about 2.9 million Palestinians. An estimated 475,000 Jewish settlers now also live in West Bank communities considered illegal under international law. Since the start of this year, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has claimed the lives of 63 Palestinian adults and children, including militants and civilians. 13 Israeli adults and children, including members of the security forces and civilians, and 1 Ukrainian civilian have been killed over the same period. The violence follows the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since at least 2005. The United States has condemned the rampaging of villages in the West Bank. It has also said that Israel must hold settler vigilantes accountable for torching of Palestinian homes and cars. But so far, apart from condemnations for the record that do not translate into action, the international community does not seem to care much about Palestinian deaths.
Before moving forward, let's take a look at what's making the headlines across the region.
One person killed in West Bank. Houses and cars set on fire by Israeli settlers. Mobs of settlers went on a rampage in a village in Huwara city. Earlier, a Palestinian gunman killed 2 Israeli brothers in West Bank. Turkey President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announces plans to hold the elections on May 14th, even as the country is recovering from 2 devastating earthquakes that also struck neighboring Syria on February 6th. Iran arrests 4 as hundreds of respiratory distress cases among schoolgirls have been reported in the last 3 months. Reports said it could be an attempt to force closure of girls' schools in Iran. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres visits Iraq, pledges support for Iraq's efforts to regain stability and security. Supermarkets in Lebanon start pricing items in US dollars as local currency tanks. Local currency traded at almost 90,000 to $1 on Thursday.
Now, what's happening in the West Bank is not the only headache for Benjamin Netanyahu. Fractures in the coalition over promises made for partners in the alliance are widening. Knesset boycott, resignations, also protests all across against his government. Now the question is, will Benjamin Netanyahu stay the prime minister for Israelis? Will he be able to make it? Our next report tells you more.
Israelis have been on the streets for several weeks protesting against judicial reforms, but on Thursday, there was high drama when protesters gathered in front of a hair salon in Tel Aviv, where Netanyahu's wife Sarah was said to be visiting. The protesters blocked the roads outside the salon. Sarah was eventually led outside and left in a car under high security. Israel has witnessed regular protests against the Benjamin Netanyahu government's judicial overhaul plan. The nationwide demonstrations turned violent on Wednesday as the police used stun guns and horses in an attempt to disperse the crowd. However, what caught the attention during the protest in Jerusalem was more and more women joining the protests. And that too, some of them dressed as characters from The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood's dystopian 1985 novel turned television series. Dressed in red capes and white face obscuring bonnets, the women travelled to Jerusalem by train and marched to the Supreme Court, where they staged a demonstration. Some observers called such protests as moving and inspiring.
Basically, it feels like we can say goodbye to democracy. because on one hand, the Knesset will have the ability to pass any law they want. On the other hand, the court will not have the ability to stop anything like that. Any court that would hurt, whether women or LGBTs or any other minority, is going to pass with no one to stop it. And this current government, including a lot of parties and representatives that believe that there is no gender equality, and that women are worthless, so it's really going to damage our status in Israel.
Wednesday was declared a nationwide day of disruption, with some protests turning violent in Tel Aviv. In images not seen in Tel Aviv demonstrations in years, police on horseback tried to stop demonstrators from breaching barricades as traffic piled up. Live footage showed police dragging protesters off the road as demonstrators called out "Shame" and "We are the majority and we're out on the streets." Images of the protest captured dozens of blue and white flags waving in the sun-filled streets. Police employed stun grenades and water cannons in a rare use of force in the coastal city. Police said at least 9 people were arrested. The judicial reform plans include giving ruling coalition lawmakers a decisive say in picking judges. It limits the scope of Supreme Court to strike down legislation or rule against the executive. Critics accuse Netanyahu of pushing the legislation in order to escape the corruption trials that he is currently facing. Netanyahu denies that. He says the trials are collapsing on their own and that the changes are necessary in the light of judicial overreach by unelected judges.
We can't accept violence. We can't accept beating police officers. We can't accept blocking roads. We can't accept threats to public personalities and their families, a thing that is happening at this moment exactly in the heart of Tel Aviv. We will not accept breaking the rules and violence, not in Huwara, not in Tel Aviv, and not anywhere.
Netanyahu formed a government 2 months ago, promising his coalition partners that he would overhaul the judiciary and entrench Israel's control of the West Bank. Critics say the proposals undermine judicial independence. The overhaul has yet to become law, but it has already affected the currency. It has raised concerns among some Western allies about the health of Israeli democracy. The rival sides are digging in, deepening one of Israel's worst domestic crises. The protests have sent shockwaves through Israel and pose a serious challenge to Netanyahu. Bureau Report WION, World is One.
Recently, a Pentagon official said that Iran could make the program needed for a device in 12 days if it wanted to do so. Now, this comes just after a recent report suggested that Iran is at an enrichment level very close to that of bomb potential. Now, Tehran has played down the development, but the question is still there. Is Iran secretly enhancing its nuclear weapons program? This week we bring you a special report from West Asia. Let's take a look.
It's a new headache brewing up for the West. Iran and its nuclear capabilities are under the scanner yet again. U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Kahl says that 12 days, that's all it can take Iran to produce 1 bomb's worth of fissile material. Fissile material is a material capable of sustaining a nuclear fission chain reaction, such as some uranium. Washington says when the Trump administration decided to leave the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, it would have taken Iran about 12 months. But now it could be a matter of just 12 days. This comes as the UN nuclear watchdog says it detected particles of uranium enriched up just under the 90% needed to produce an atomic bomb. Though the Atomic Energy Agency maintains that discussions are still ongoing to determine the origin of these particles, but the statement is alarming for the West. CIA Director William Burns also weighed in, saying that Iran's nuclear program is advancing at a worrisome pace. However, the CIA Director remains cautious and asserts that the US believes that Tehran had not decided to resume the weaponization program.
My heart goes out
So why is the nuclear watchdog's report raising fears? Well, IAEA's report says the agency found traces of uranium enriched to up to 83.7% purity at Iran's Fordow enrichment plant. To make an atom bomb, uranium needs to be enriched to around 90%. Even though the IAEA has repeatedly warned it has lost its ability to fully monitor Iran's nuclear program since February 2021. Reports say the head of the agency would visit Iran this week for high-level meetings. Tehran has, however, repeatedly insisted it is not planning to build a nuclear bomb. Iran says it only wants to harness the nuclear technology for civil uses. Responding to the IAEA's report, Tehran says that the presence of the particles is due to unintended fluctuations, which may have occurred during the enrichment process.
Regarding the 84% enriched uranium particle, it was a sample taken from beside a valve. It's a particle that can't be seen even under a microscope. What matters is the product that is stored after production. They examined the enrichment level of processed material and realized it didn't exceed 60% at all.
Well, this is not the first time Iran's nuclear ambitions have come under the radar. Iran has been enriching uranium well over the limits laid down in a 2015 deal with world powers. The US states withdrew from the deal in 2018. The deal was designed to give Iran relief from sanctions in return for curbs that were put on its atomic program. In 2021, negotiations between world powers to return to the deal started, but have stalled since last year. Till now, the long, winding negotiations have failed to reach any conclusion. And this new report is ringing alarm bells in Western capitals. The West dreads a nuclear weapon in the hands of the Iranian regime, straining the already frayed ties between Tehran and the West. Fordow, which sits under a mountain near the holy Shiite city of Qom, is at the epicenter of tensions. Fordow plant is about the size of a football field. It is large enough to house 3,000 centrifuges, but small and hardened enough to make the Biden administration suspect that they could be used to produce an atomic weapon. And apart from the US, closer to Iran is Israel, which continues to warn it will not allow Iran to obtain a nuclear bomb. Iran faces internal unrest after months of protests. The West is also furious over accusations that Iran is sending drones to enabling Russia to target Ukraine. Tehran has repeatedly rubbished the allegations, but the explanation from Iran isn't enough to satisfy the West. Meanwhile, last week, Iran unveiled a new cruise missile with a range of 1,650 kilometers that could potentially reach Israel. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard's aerospace division boasts that the missile could hit its target with 100% precision, and giving a new headache to Israel and its Western allies.
And now let's go to Syria. It looks like there is change in the horizon for Syria. Many Arab nations are warming up to the war-ravaged nation. Now, in the past few weeks, and especially after the February 6 earthquake, many Arab diplomats have visited Damascus, met with President Bashar al-Assad. Now, the question is it really too early to predict what the outcome of these opportunities would be and how they would affect the trajectory of reintegrating Syria into the Arab region? We bring you this report.
Is the Arab world warming up to Syria? Is the earthquake giving a chance to Syria's President al-Assad? The recent visits of foreign leaders to Syria have been a precursor to signs of thawing ties between Syria and the Arab countries. Syria has been more or less isolated for more than a decade over the conflict. In 2011, Assad's government led a deadly crackdown on protests that erupted against his rule. Soon after, the Arab League suspended Syria's membership. The United States and the European Union also disengaged with Assad. But it looks like Assad is gaining with an outpouring of support from Arab states after the two earthquakes on the 6th of February. Last week, a delegation of Arab parliamentarians met Assad in Damascus. The heads of the Iraqi, Jordanian, Palestinian, Libyan, Egyptian and UAE houses of representatives, as well as representatives from Oman and Lebanon, travelled to Syria. The delegation visit follows a mini summit in Baghdad, affirming the Arab League's intentions of having Syria return to the organization. The visit comes as the Egyptian foreign minister also travelled to Damascus. It was the first such visit by an Egyptian foreign minister since 2011. Before that, Jordan's foreign minister made his first trip to Damascus on February 15th. Emirati Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan also met Assad to discuss the humanitarian repercussions of the earthquakes. Surprisingly, Assad then travelled to Oman on the 20th of February. The latest overtures come as two powerful earthquakes rocked Syria and Turkey last month. The toll from the quakes and subsequent aftershocks has surpassed 50,000, including around 6,000 deaths in Syria. The humanitarian crisis has prompted Arab states to dispatch aid to Syria and Turkey. The wave of support for Syria comes despite US sanctions on businesses, individuals and state institutions that allegedly support the Assad government. While Assad appears to be seizing on the earthquake response to improve his international standing, Qatar and Saudi Arabia continue to maintain their distance. Only time will tell whether and when Syria will finally be embraced again as before.
In the middle of war and death, you can always find hope. We're ending the show on a miraculous note. Here's a story of a horse that survived 21 days without water or food under the rubble. Now we all know about the deadly earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria. Here's a story about a miracle. The horse is now safe and with its owner. Check it out. That's all we have for you on this episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you always the most recent updates, news, stories and ground reports from the most volatile region in the world. Until then, stay safe. I am Ghadi Francis, coming to you from Lebanon in West Asia, and you're watching WION World is One.